How's it going? Good morning, how are you?
Fast and Furious. How long was our trip that?
It's a little over.
From two little girls.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Eric, y'all have a good Thanksgiving?
Yeah. Goes anywhere?
No, the kids came home.
Close.
You did, yeah, you did it right. It was good. That's awesome.
I think our goal should be to have Tracer in here 1 minute after. We got like, oh. Just start.
But apparently it's still not.
Can't get it.
No.
That's why I was sitting over there with the phone like,
Oh. Does he know that?
Oh, heck. Oh. Yeah.
they let a subscription lapse.
Oh.
But,
So. I assume you watched a certain game.
oh, yeah,
Yeah, I'm sure.
yeah, I had gotten that from I can't believe that. Well, let me just turn it flash for you. Make sure it's done. Yeah.
Yeah, about that.
Florida was going to put Florida State. What did you say? Like,
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I guess Florida State.
Georgia Tech even started off strong. Started off expecting.
Well, I'm glad all.
Check.
Well, it's on 63. No, it's set to 74, but it's on air conditioning, I think. Yeah, that's what it is. It's go.
Dave, are you aware that in the sports center in the office, that thermostat is in Todd Humphrey's? Like in all his offices.
So Todd's always coming.
So he should always be happy. Yeah, seems strange.
There we go.
Did that used to be Mike McCutcheon's office?
No, seems like it's not one of the bigger ones. I bet it's probably the most bizarre. Well, I don't know. You might be getting
It's six.
calls all the time.
Dave, it's 63 in here. When I turned on the heat, it's set on 66, so it shouldn't get too hot. But if it doesn't get hot enough, you can punch it up.
Hey, how are you? Don't say. It's
Two streets up.
God,
Sweet trip.
Did you watch the ball game yesterday?
I did, yeah, Derek. Now we're talking about that.
Well prepared to change the channel.
Oh.
Get
Yeah.
30th to go.
So I had gotten up actually and walked in the kitchen. Already playing. Like,
I pretty much don't watch out. Like, just like jump. Too excited. Well, like,
We're actually not doing land. Me composing my own songs of lament.
yesterday was wrong.
But then I'm reminded. I'm glad I've got company back there.
Florida, they both have lost it.
They should be playing the attendance on Thanksgiving. Or there's a lot of Florida and all. Somehow couldn't get out of bed. All right, we'll start. We're just going to watch a few minutes of this video for the Bible Project. We're going to be looking at the book of Zechariah today. So, and just pretty much the second half of it. So, watch the second half of their video here.
Visions. It's Joshua, the high priest again, and he's given a crown and presented as a symbol of the future Messiah, who will also be a priest over God's kingdom.
Talk about
And
that.
then Zechariah closes it all out, saying that all of these visions will be fulfilled only if the current generation is faithful to God and obeys the terms of the covenant. And so altogether, these three visions emphasize how the coming of the Messianic kingdom is conditional upon this generation being faithful to God. Which leads to the conclusion of the dreams. It's another challenge from Zechariah, and a group of Israelites come, and they've been mourning over the former temple's destruction for nearly 70 years. And they ask him, is it time to stop grieving? I mean, is God's kingdom going to come very soon? And Zechariah again reminds them of how their ancestors rejected God's call to prophets, which led to the exile. And so he challenges them too. He says, this generation will see the Messianic kingdom only if they pursue justice and peace and remain faithful to the covenant. So in other words, Zechariah reverses their question. He asks, are you going to become the kind of people who are ready to receive and participate in God's coming? And that question is left just hanging there. The people don't answer, and the book just moves on. And so we come to the final sections that are very different from chapters 1 to 8. Each section is a kaleidoscopic collage of poems and images about the future Messiah. So the first one, chapters 9 to 11, describe the coming of the humble Messianic king who's riding a donkey into the New Jerusalem to establish God's kingdom over the nations. But then, all of a sudden, this king, he's symbolized as a shepherd over the flock of Israel. And then he's rejected, first by his own people, but then also by their leaders, who are also symbolized as shepherds. And so God hands Israel over to these corrupt shepherds. And it raises the question, will Israel's rejection of their king last forever? In the final section, chapters 12 to 14, say no. It's another mosaic of poems and images about the future Messianic king. And they depict the New Jerusalem as a place where God's justice will finally confront and defeat evil among the nations. Very similar to the same themes in Prophet Joel or Ezekiel. But then God also will confront the rebellion within the hearts of his own people. He's going to pour out his Spirit on them, he says, so that they can repent and grieve over the fact that they have rebelled and rejected their Messianic shepherd. The final chapter concludes with the New Jerusalem as the gathering point for all of the nations. And then this city becomes a new Garden of Eden, and there's a river of living water flowing out of the temple, bringing healing to all of creation, and that's how the book ends. And so Zechariah just leaves you to ponder the connection between chapters 1 through 8 and 9 to 14. And the point seems to be that this future messianic kingdom of the book's second half will only come when God's people are faithful to the covenant point of the first half. Reading the book of Zechariah is a wild ride. These visions and poems are full of startling imagery, and they do not follow a linear flow of thought. And that's part of the point. It's like history and our lives. It doesn't always fit into neat, orderly patterns. But the prophets offer us glimpses of God's hand at work, guiding history towards his own purposes. And so ultimately, Zechariah invites us to look above the chaos and hope for the coming of God's kingdom, which should motivate faithfulness in the present. And that's what the book of Zechariah is all about.
All right. I like when they say that it doesn't fit into a neat, orderly pattern, because I feel that that applies to a whole lot of been looking at this semester prophetic works that be kind of. All right, so we are, of course, talking about passage in Luke, road to Emmaus, conversation, Jesus, speculative conversation Jesus was having with his followers. A couple of the verses that we keep coming back to, they say we'd hoped he was going to be the one to redeem Israel. Not only this, but it's now the third day since these things happened. And so it begs this question, what did they think the Messiah was going to do? And what then did Jesus say, this is what the Messiah will do, or this is what I have done? Different visions of the Messiah, different ideas about what the Messiah could be, would be, both what they saw when he was here and what we'll see again. This other verse here where he calls them foolish ones, slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Said before, that one kind of cuts to me when I see that. These are people who have walked with Jesus, still didn't see the things that perhaps they should have seen. Foolish ones. It says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted them in all the scriptures of things concerning himself. It's the idea that these scriptures are about him. Of course, talking about after their meal, Jesus disappears. It said, not our hearts were within us while he taught us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures. Kind of our goal, of course, is to open these scriptures to our awareness. But of course, what scriptures? Obviously, we're talking about the law and the prophets, the Old Testament, not the New Testament. But in particular, what would Jesus have taught them about this long walk to Emmaus, eating. What were those scriptures? That'd be nice. Just laid it all out for us. But as we've seen, there's a whole lot in the Old Testament that Jesus could have been talking to them about, because there's a whole lot in the Old Testament that talks about both his first and his second coming. And so, who knows? If he covered them all, I'm sure he'd do a pretty good job with it. But it's fun to think about. So, the goal here is to see the full picture of Jesus. If we understand not just the Gospels, not just the New Testament, but if we understand what the Old Testament is telling us about Jesus, about both his first and his second coming, then we understand Jesus a little bit better. Know who we're worshiping a little bit better. I think that's probably a good goal for us. So a couple of themes we've talked about. The idea of, this double idea of the Messiah, two visions of the Messiah, one being the suffering servant, another being the conquering king, and how these are both there in the Old Testament. There's good reason that Jews expected to see a conquering king come in the form of the Messiah, because it's there. They weren't wrong to expect it. They didn't pick up the fact that he came as this other version of the Messiah that's also there. This idea of the suffering servant. And so both of these ideas of the suffering servant coming and the conquering king coming are there in the Old Testament, and they play themselves out in history. Jesus came as a suffering servant, and he will come as the conquering king. We looked at this map, several different passages that trace this movement of Jesus' second coming, coming kind of from the south and going northward towards Jerusalem. Clouds, army of angels with him, and things like that, in order to save his people and punish his enemies. We've seen it numerous times now in several passages. We'll see it again today. This idea is coming from Mount Sinai, coming from the south, and that same route that the Israelites took during the Exodus, more or less, right, coming to the wilderness towards the promise. So that we've seen these kind of patterns the Bible uses. Several passages getting that this march of Jesus and his army in order to destroy his enemies, to save his people. So today we're going to look at Zechariah. I want to show that video just to give you a brief overview. Zechariah is a very difficult book. I think probably most of us, I know I can say that of just about all the prophets, because a lot there. There's a lot that it alludes to in the Old Testament, a lot that it foresees in the future, and my own lack of full knowledge and understanding of the Bible gets in the way of that, because these prophets are playing into that, referencing things that have already happened, things that will happen soon to the Israelites, things that will happen far distant future. And so they're putting together, using ideas that come throughout different parts of the Bible. So it can make it pretty confusing. 21st century readers are pretty unfamiliar with, unfortunately, a lot of the history that we should know better, and really, unfortunately, not familiar enough with the Bible. Zechariah is one. I had a Bible professor in college that he was from Texas, and real plain spoken. He did poorly on like a paper, an essay or something, a test. He was very just blunt about that too. But I remember him saying, this is one of the words, like, sometimes God just tells you what you ought to do. Word for word thing. It's just not hard. Sometimes God just tells it like it is. And this is one of the words from Zechariah, not the part we're looking at, but here's where God just lays it out for you. The word of the Lord came to Zechariah saying, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, render true judgment, show kindness and mercy to one another, not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, or the poor, and let none of you devise evil against another in your heart." Here, professor saying, just do that. Micah was another one just like that. God just kind of lays it out. This is what I want you to do. Makes it kind of easy for us in those moments. Obviously, life gets in the way. Our sinful nature gets in the way of it. Of course, we have the same thing. Love God, love your neighbor. Pretty easy, right? I liked that teacher. It was good. Making things obvious. All right, so let's think about this first part of the book of Zechariah, or the second part of the book. The first part of the second part of the book, I guess I should say. We have this imagery of the coming of the Messiah, the coming King. And when he comes, he'll be riding on donkeys. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, the King is coming to you, righteous and having salvation to see, humble, mounted on a donkey, on a colt, full of donkeys. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, war horse from Jerusalem. Battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall speak peace to the nations. His rule shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. And so what we see here is this mixture, right, of the first and second coming of Jesus. We're going to get this a couple times in this book. We've seen that. This has already happened. He comes on a donkey. He enters Jerusalem on a donkey. All four of the Gospels describe his entrance into Jerusalem before he dies on donkey. Verses later, then the Lord will appear over them, and his arrows will go forth like lightning. The Lord God will sound the trumpet, will march forth in the whirlwinds of the south. And so we see verse 10, and then here in verse 14, a far more militarily triumphant version of the Messiah. We've seen this idea, like I said, of him marching through the south towards Jerusalem, from the south towards Jerusalem. Looked at a number of these verses for several weeks now. The Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came from 10,000 with the flaming fire in his right hand. All these different verses are using similar imagery, telling us the same thing, saying this is what this is going to be like. And we're getting it in a number of different places in the Old Testament. So when we think back to, that road to Emmaus conversation, Jesus, it's easy to see Jesus saying, right, here's some of these moments that in the law and the prophets, this has kind of been laid out. This is how it's going to happen. Just listen to this. We see it in Judges, same idea. Power of God. Mountains quaking and things as he comes from the south towards Jerusalem. We see the Psalms. We're not done with that first part yet. We have the second part of the second half of the book of Zechariah. We have further imagery of this coming Messiah. It says, on that day, I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace, pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. This is interesting. We know who this is. Jesus is, now we know who this is. He's been pierced, right? Here's Jesus saying, look at me, I've been pierced. When they see me, this is what's going to happen on that day. And so we get in Zechariah both visions of the first coming and visions of the second. You get numerous, and if you read through that, we're not going to read all of chapter 9 through 14, but there are quite a few little tidbits in there that you'll recognize. Things that sound familiar from the first coming, like riding on a donkey and being pierced, and things that, are reminiscent of some New Testament passages about the second coming, clouds, coming as angels, things like that. And so that little video at the beginning, I like, what he says, that it's nonlinear and it's kind of hodgepodge. And that's what it is. But it's all there. And again, it's describing, I think it works, because we're talking about these two different visions of Messiah, the suffering servant, the conquering king. It's the same person. He's just coming twice. And so it makes sense that as they're talking about Jesus, that they're talking about his characteristics and his features in this way that the elements of the first and the second coming are both there. Because if you understand what it's saying, we say, okay, we're just talking about Jesus. It's like we could talk about each other in some way and use parts of your life that are, well, you grew up here, but, you're here now, and this is your job now, this is your job then, and we could throw out different things about your life. Say, we were just Thanksgiving. People with family definitely do that all the time, right? We sit around and talk, we're throwing out stories about crazy Uncle so-and-so or grandma or whatever, and people are telling different little parts of someone's life, telling stories, and it's not linear or anything like that, but it's all the different parts of that person that we all kind of know and kind of laugh about and reminisce about when we're together, right? And so it makes sense. And again, it's not the way we like literature or narrative to happen now. We want a lot more straightforward, more linear, and things like that. But it kind of works because they're talking about one person. And I think that's why maybe Jesus, calls them foolish ones or Emmaus. Just describing me the whole time. Sometimes we make it more complicated. Has to. All right, so what we're going to see in these chapters is this phrase, on that day, quite a few times. Or phrases similar to that. Quite a bit. Chapter 13 uses it a lot. 14 uses it a whole lot. Behold, the day is coming for the Lord. And on that day, on that day, on that day, and on that day, and on that day, and there shall be on that day, all these on that day things. We talked about this a couple years ago in this class. We spent a little bit of time talking about the idea of the day of the Lord. But review a little bit of that because we get a lot of it here in this part of Zechariah. What exactly is that day? And I think it works when we think about the whole thing we're talking about, the first and the second coming of Jesus. They're, in the person of Jesus, these two different visions or understanding of Messiah, both exist within the one person of Jesus, right? So it makes sense that the day of the Lord also has this double. We get the day of the Lord quite a bit in the Old Testament, mentioned, wail for the day of the Lord is near, destruction of the Almighty will come. And that's kind of the version that we're used to. It's always calamitous in the way we think about it. When the day of the Lord is mentioned, destruction, things like that. For the day of the Lord is near upon the nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deed shall return on your own head. That's an Obadiah. Anytime we sneak an Obadiah, there's one. I'm sure we're all. For the day of the Lord is great and very awesome. Who can endure it? Joel. So that term, day of the Lord, is used in Joel several times. Then it's used throughout the other prophets, here and there 13 times. And in other terms, aside from that, day of the Lord, I'm trying to pronounce, they would say it. That day, in those days, on that day, that's what we see in Zechariah a lot. We get quite a bit of that. And that's all talking about the same day, this day of the Lord. Who can endure the day of his coming? Again, it doesn't say the day of the Lord, but the day of his coming is the same day, right? We have all of our instances in Zechariah that we get it in the New Testament as well. It's not just a turn of phrase used in the Old Testament. It's used both. throughout the Bible, quite a bit. There's no sense that this is an idea that's lost to us or something that just happens in the Old Testament. Day of the Lord will come like a thief at night. He is able to guard until that day what has been entrusted to me. So again, this idea of that day, the day of the Lord, that we're going to see in Zechariah a lot, runs throughout the Bible, and it's always talking about the same thing. So what is this day of the Lord? Exactly are we talking about? What are we talking about? Day when Jesus comes back? Okay. What else could it be? Because if the prophets are using it, the prophets aren't just talking about the second coming of Jesus, right? The prophets are also talking about the coming of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, things like that. Prophets are also many times talking about things that are directly going to influence the people they're talking to in the moment. The second coming of Jesus. So what else? I mean, yes, you're right, but what else? What more? It's not just that. You can't just, right? That's what the New Testament writers. The day that is drawing near is the second coming. We have Joel. The day of the Lord is near, and as destruction from the Almighty it comes. So we're talking about any time that God kind of acts to do exactly what he's going to do when Jesus returns. God acts to save his people and punish the wicked. He does this a lot. He does it to Israel, through the Assyrians, Babylonians, and he does it to the enemies of his people. Sometimes it's a direct...
Okay, I found this on the web for End of the Babylonians, or whoever does it to the enemies of his people. Check it out.
Thank you. Yes, Lord.
It's a voice from on high.
Just waiting for it to take the rest of the class time. Just let AI teach us from now on. Okay. It would be really fun to see. Anyway, so the day of the Lord is when God comes to judge wicked. God comes to punish those who need to be punished. And so the prophets talk about lots of days of prophets. I mean, it's common. Just saying. And obviously, the final day of the Lord is, and the day of the Lord referred to in the New Testament, is the second of Jesus. But what we see, of course, in these prophets is patterns, things that repeat themselves, the themes that keep coming back. And so the cycle of God intervening in some ways, either directly or through an army or a plague of locusts or something like that, is God punishing the wicked and saving his people, trying again, and the way it goes to restore his people to him. Right? So this is what continually happens to Israel. Prophets talk about. Right? You've fallen away from God, so this bad thing's going to happen to you, and you're going to turn back to God. Maybe this time you'll stay faithful. Of course they don't. But that cycle keeps happening, right? So that's why we need days of the Lord keep happening. Prophets keep talking about the days of, but of course they are talking about the ultimate day of the Lord when the exact same kind of thing is going to happen. It's just far grander, final scope.
Zechariah 7:7 be a unique day, no moment, no solution day. Time.
No more need for light. God will be light. You know, I mean, it's a unique day. We don't know. And also when we the day of the Lord is also not always one day in the Old Testament. I mean, the process of Israel and Judah being defeated by the Assyrians in Babylon doesn't just happen in one big flash, kabam, you know, the Assyrians appear out of the sky and poof, everything has changed. Right? I mean, this is not a long process. What I mean, it's a process. Yeah. So, you know, the day of the Lord is an expression, and certainly the indication, you know, when we see God coming and coming on the clouds and things like that, it's going to be notable. But yeah, I don't. There are enough descriptions of days in the Bible, enough references to it. But yeah, I went through, read all of them, and see exactly what that unique day will be like. But what's important is that it is the second coming, the idea of the day of the Lord, this final day of the Lord, is completely in line with the way that prophets have talked about a day of the Lord happening throughout the time of the Old Testament. It's going to God intervening in the world in order to save his people or punish them. Through Jesus, it's a lot. Obviously, the finality of it is great. Joel's a good example. Joel, major theme in Joel is this idea, and he talks about it quite a bit. We're not going to read this whole thing. And afterward, pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on male and female slaves in those days, pour out my spirit. We'll see that in the Testament. Again, before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. So we go through this process of what's happening. And for Joel, those days, at that time, he does a lot of this. Plowshares into swords, and pruning hooks into spears. Elsewhere, the day of the Lord is here. So we've seen this picture before, right? Scott likes this one because it's in the mountains, where he always is. There's a passage in Joel, we didn't read the whole thing, but any of these prophecies about the day of the Lord we're talking about right now, we're talking about this. And I like the illustration here. Scott's used a lot, because from this view you can see what's up close, what's right now, the mountain that you're on, but you can also see things far off. Right, and this is how we see these prophecies work. It has to do with right now, but it also has to do with. So Joel is prophesying about what's happening right then. Their crops are dying. Locusts, the plague of locusts is destroying their crops. And they can't sacrifice, can't give the offering they're supposed to give at the temple because wheat's gone, wine is gone. And the issue is whether or not people care. So Joel talks about it like, you're not going to be able to do what you're required to do by God. But there's also the issue of whether or not you even care that you can't do what God requires you to do. And so he's writing about this, right now. These bad things are happening. Famine and plague, this is happening right now today. It could also be talking about the coming of or could be referring to the Babylonians. People don't know exactly the idea of Babylonians descending. This kind of works. Talking about in the future, using locusts in this language that Israelites know, kind of like what happened to us in the Babylonian sense. But he's also talking about, the language makes it obvious that he's talking about the future because it gets used again in the New Testament. And we've seen this before in the past several weeks. That this language of what's going to happen in the future that the prophets use, New Testament writers, they pick up on it. In this case, Peter says, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days, it will be, God declares, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Sons and daughters will prophesy and so forth. Right? And so we see that same, practice that we've seen before, right? All these prophecies, we're looking back at the Old Testament and making sense of it. And a lot of New Testament writers have helped us out because they're doing the same thing. These prophecies don't exist just in the Old Testament, right? They exist in the New Testament. Jesus, it's all about him. What he says on the road to Emmaus, right? All these scriptures that are all about me. So here in this day of the Lord, it's talking about something that's happening right then to the Israelites. It's also talking about something that, according to Peter, was still in the far-off future when Joel was prophesying. And so we see what happens with prophets. You get all these warnings. Lots of warnings. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. They don't listen. God does something. Sometimes against his people, sometimes against other nations. And when God needs to intervene, when the day of the Lord occurs, it's not just some little something you might forget about the next day. It changes the course of what's happening. It changes what's happening with the Israelites. But what makes it better for them or worse for them in the moment depends on kind of where they are in that pattern. They're following God and falling away from God and coming back to him. And so that's what these prophets are doing when they refer to a day of the Lord, talking about one of these moments. God intervenes in a pretty extreme way. And then New Testament writers see it's not just talking about this one moment in the Old Testament, it's also talking about a future something. So that's the pattern we see, and that's what we get in Zechariah. Zephaniah, example, I will bring such distress upon people that they shall walk like the blind because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood shall be poured out like dust and their flesh like dung. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them on the day of the Lord's wrath. The fire of his passion, the whole earth shall be consumed. Oh, terrible end he will make of all the inhabitants of the earth. That's good Old Testament prophetic language right there. That's what we think of, but we think of that as being kind of double meaning. More than that, right? Prophecy right now, but also prophecy of the future. Several of those. So it's relevant to their audience, and it's also relevant to what's going to happen in the future. Both what happens at Jesus' first coming, which for them was still in the future, for us, and what's going to happen at Jesus' second coming, for all of us, is in the future. So that day, or upon that day, or the day of the Lord, when we see that phrase, we need to contextualize that, realize that phrase is a theme throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. This is what it's talking Yes, there will be the ultimate day of the Lord when all of a sudden the dead are judged. It's also everything happens. New earth, Jerusalem. And so, what we've seen in all of these verses we've been looking at, God marching from the south, army in tow towards Jerusalem, it's to establish justice and to judge. Right? It's both the motivation to this. That's the case every time. God's going to save his people, and he's also going to punish those who need to be punished. It's that double-edged bit about God's grace and judgment that I said before you. That God's grace is continually overwhelming and surprising at just how bountiful it is and who all is offered grace and how often they're offered grace. God's begging everyone to come back. Talked about that when we did study Revelation, right? All these cosmic things happening. God's trying to get people's attention, draw them back to him. So his grace is huge, but there will be a judgment. There will be punishment. So we have verses like 3:16 that we all know. There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Who shall bring any charge against God? Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. So we have this also, right? And that's right after John 3:16, 3:8. So we have that element of it. God's going to act justly. He's going to establish justice. He's going to be fair. He's going to save who are oppressed, save his people. He's also going to punish those who wicked. This is evidence of the righteous judgment of God, that you may be considered worthy of God. When the Lord Jesus is revealed from the heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, inflicting vengeance on those who do not know God, on those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord, they will suffer punishment. That's there too. Just like the salvation and grace is there. It's hard. This is a harder one for some of us to swallow. All right, so back to Zechariah. And on that day, he's going to say it so many times in Zechariah. We're talking about things happening now. We're talking about them now. We're talking about we see going to happen in the future. Then, and on that day, I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants the spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him. One shall one weep. This is going to happen on that day. So one of the things that I wanted to stress the study is that all the hundreds of prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament, a lot of them are about his first coming. Trace those and see how they are fulfilled. A lot of them are about his second coming. A lot of those we tend to overlook. Confusing to us, kind of force us to think about end times and that whole can of worms. What's that going to be like? Are we supposed to think of that? But prophecies of the second coming are in the Old Testament, not just the first coming. The second is also. That's not something I think about. Later in Zechariah, behold, the day is coming. This is the beginning of chapter 14, which very much talk about images of the second coming. Behold, the day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem for battle. And the city shall be taken, and houses plundered, women raped. Half of the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of day of battle. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives, lies before Jerusalem on the east. The Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall be northward, and the other half southward. You see several different passages here that think about what that day, on that day, what it will be like. Why we should think this is not all prophecies are about Jesus' first coming, because it would appear that some things that are described, haven't really happened yet.
Fascinating how all the prophets, some of them change. Seen that Isaiah back at
I saw the one in Psalms.
Yeah, Psalms.
Yeah. Which is challenging for me. I mean, even when you say like a New Jerusalem, the end of Revelation, it's like, okay, well, that's the end. Like, I can say that my acceptance. I can accept that easier. Like, these are just like crazy. That's because if that happened in our lifetime, you'd think, well, I guess we would witness it, and we would have to look at it and say, oh, look, that's happening in a way that we're not used to thinking about God-type events happening in
cheap bread that be like in a roadway, that highway, or easily.
You shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach Azal. You shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. You've seen that very language used so many times here in all these passages we're looking at, like referring to God's second coming. It's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament. God coming with his holy thing. On that day there shall be no light, cold, or frost, and there shall be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light. On that day living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day the Lord will be one in his name. The whole land, and here's we talk about geography changing. The whole land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. So this is all the area around Jerusalem, basically. But Jerusalem shall remain aloft on its site from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the former gate, the corner gate of the tower of Hananel, to the king's wine presses. And so basically what it's saying is like it'll be flattened out, be a plain where there are now hills, but Jerusalem will still be higher. We've seen images of Jerusalem as a mountain, rivers flowing out from the New Jerusalem. And again, here we have geography described in a way that is not the geography that is now. And again, this is challenging. This is challenging to me. Say, well, that can be pretty symbolic, right? But I don't know how it can be. It seems a stretch to say. That's what I'm saying. It sounds a stretch to say this is symbolic, but that's what I think instinctively a lot of us want to say, because believing some of the crazy events of the Bible, I think is easy because it happened a long time ago. I believe it in my bones. This stuff happened. But the idea of it happening now just seems so strange to say, that's going to have some other meaning. It can't just be that. It can't mean it's going to stand on the Mount of Olives. Right? Because that doesn't seem like kind of. So if you said that happened, 20,000 years ago or whatever, like, all right, that's fine. But I think it's challenging because it forces us into this idea of believing in some of these wondrous works of God and the day of the Lord in kind of future times or modern times. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe that's just me, but I find this kind of stuff very challenging, based on just kind of how I grown up preaching the Bible. And it shall be inhabited, Jerusalem it is, for there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. I definitely don't think we've gotten to that point in history. Let's see. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. Something like that. Okay, but we're all Indiana Jones in the sense that every time, and I'm a nerd, when I was a kid, they actually had Indiana Jones novels that came out, and I read them. And every time in the movies, and in the books, but in the movies, every time Indiana Jones sees something supernatural, he tends not to be right. Even though we've seen in the movies, he has witnessed everything there is to witness, right? And yet he's still like, I don't believe this, right? Until it all happens. Even the bad things. And I think we do the same thing. It's like, do I believe in God or not? I believe in the power of God. He created everything. I believe all these stories, about crazy stuff happening. But you get up into like our own times, and I'm like, well, that's like, yeah. So
Used to
people
have
rotting out. Like
all this was like the end, the judgment, and this all happened at the same time. But is it? I mean, this could happen and judgment happen later, or if this happens, sheep, goat, split, go to heaven. You know what I'm asking?
no. Sorry. No.
In the end, God's going to come judge him. Is this part of the end, or is this before the end?
Well, what we've been saying is this is all on that day, on that day, on that day, on that day. So this is all part of the second coming. Like I said, one day, I'm not sure. I think the phrase "on that day" and the day of the Lord can refer to a time span, maybe not a long time span, or I don't think it's going to be a unique day. Right? I don't know if 24 hours is really going to be a measuring stick that we care about at that point. Is that what you're asking? Like,
It's like a very late day, like Jeff's asking. Track the geography again. Remember the way these prophets have done this. We've seen something happen from Sinai, going up to the desert again, going up to Edom, and Zechariah is taken. So it's a Psalm 68 session. It's not over. It's playing out the entire world. Which is exactly what he said that.
Established.
Yeah, like exactly. Everybody's to see. Yeah.
Oh,
And you got the Holy One. Seeing that back at Deuteronomy, he's outlining. Shows you see.
and everyone's seeing it. Because we talked about this a lot when we did Revelation a couple years ago. I mean, God's doing a lot to get our attention. Like, up until that last minute, when there's going to be final judgment and people are going to be cast away, eternal punishment, up until God's like breaking the world in half, trying to get people to, realize that, they need to, okay, I repent, I'm going to follow God, He can save us, right? Like, God's going to very extreme measures to get everyone's attention. So, it makes perfect sense that things extreme are going to happen leading up to that. That's what we see in Revelation, is that God's begging people to, come to Him before that last moment. It's too late. See, I don't think he's going to sneak in and just. Of course, the thief is nice. They sneak. Anyway, I think there will be plenty of.
Not to like headline this thing. You were in Jerusalem. Is it a divided city tonight? With half the people. Zechariah, I think that's absolutely crazy. I mean, who would have? You saw the amount of prophecy that right? All hinges upon what they this is talking about the gospel going out to the west. That's plenty of sense. We'll just skip over. You know. Yeah. They go. Yeah, where you saw there. That's why. There, ground. Another Muslim cemetery. Okay. Put some rocks over it. Hey, that'll work. Yeah.
All right, this is stopping point. I guess we need to stop. Scott will next week.
Yeah, we're gonna head to the New Testament and
more fun and games
and see how. I mean, the same language. They did a great job. Same language. It's not to see all of it. So Paul study pick that up. And then next week, come prepared to read is all we're going to do is read. We're going to just ask a question, read Old Testament, read New Testament, see how it all together. And then we're going to have a Christmas party, right? And Derek will answer all your questions.
Christmas party. Christmas party of Day of the Lord.
Good. Yeah. That's the day of the Lord. No, two of them are here.
Emma had to work Thanksgiving, but they're all Jack's great. I know. We had it Wednesday. Emma had to work Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Oh,
See ya. Thank you.
Did a good job with some.
So we had it a day early.
yeah.
You spent like,
Didn't get too far to Zechariah, but that's all right.
how much you
Not a whole lot, but a couple things that I figured we could say.
Carrie.
Maybe just talk about something kind of like talking about going back to not just the geography.
Did y'all have open house? Sorry.
Oh, the holiday day thing?
Mm-hmm.
Home holiday. It's this weekend. It's coming week.
Oh.
Yeah, I won't be here.
Won't be here.
I'm the worst husband ever. She knew that when she said yes. Yeah, I'll be in Sacramento, California. We have 4 runners at the